A rough hand clamped down on a wrinkled arm, yanking it hard in the middle of a packed intersection, a shout tearing through the air. "Look at this! A stinking old black woman should have rotted away in a nursing home." Rosa stumbled her bag of vegetables, hit the ground, green leaves scattered across the street. Her thin hand trembled violently, but her eyes still looked up cold as a blade. The crowd erupted in protest. "Let her go," but Kane sneered, jabbing a finger at her face. "Anyone who defends her, give me your wrist and I'll cuff you right now." The rage on the street was ready to explode, and in the harsh sunlight, the image of an old woman being trampled became the spark for an oncoming storm. The midday sun scorched the commercial streetlight, reflecting off the pavement in thick waves of heat that made the air ripple faintly, and even the rare breeze carried nothing but dry, burning warmth. People packed the sidewalk, sales calls mixed with blaring horns. The smell of street food tangled with dust and fumes, creating a chaotic scene that was both lively and exhausting. In the middle of the hurrying crowd, Rosa appeared with slow, deliberate steps, a bag of freshly bought vegetables in her hand, each footfall pressing against the blistering concrete that felt like it could burn skin. Her thinning silver hair and slightly hunched back spoke of old age, but her eyes were sharp and resolute like a small flame holding out in a storm. She was used to the prying stares, used to the offhanded, condescending remarks from strangers, and used to feeling out of place in this overcrowded city. But being used to it didn't mean accepting it, and her quiet determination gave her slow walk a quiet defiance. Heavy footsteps suddenly broke through the flow of people. A large figure lunged forward and blocked her path, taking up the entire width of the sidewalk. Officer Kane appeared like a slab of cold stone, his shadow falling completely over Rosa, casting a dark contrast against the bright sunlight. Passers-by froze, some held their breath, others slipped away quietly, leaving only the old woman and the officer standing in that pocket of space. Kane's eyes blazed, his voice raspy and sharp like scraping metal. "You think this sidewalk is for dirty skin like yours? The gutter's more fitting." His words hit like a blow in the stifling air, making even the onlookers shudder. The heat had already put everyone on edge, but that sentence spread like an oil slick, igniting disgust and contempt, tightening the already heavy atmosphere. Rosa stopped the bag in her hand, trembled slightly in the breeze, green vegetables poking out as if trying to flee the tension. She took a deep breath, then lifted her head. Her face bore the marks of time, lips pressed gently together, her gaze calm, but as cold as a frost-covered lake in winter. She didn't need to argue, didn't need to shout to prove anything, because the stillness in her eyes was already an answer to his hostility. Kane paused for a split second, surprised that the frail old woman could stare him down without blinking, without a trace of fear. But he quickly covered his reaction with a sneer, his lips curling like a gash across his face. That smile made the air feel even heavier, like a thunderstorm pressed into a single moment just before it broke. In the silent crowd, a young man slowly pulled out his phone, his hand slightly trembling with tension. He leaned toward his friend and whispered just loud enough to zoom in on his badge. The friend gave a subtle nod, eyes wide, as the lens pointed straight at the snarling face of the officer. His fingers gripped the phone tightly, each tiny shake of nervousness rippling across the screen. This was no longer just curiosity. It was a choice and instinct to capture what was unfolding, because they knew that once the words and actions of authority crossed a line, evidence was the only weapon truth had. Rosa remained silent, her small shoulders rising gently with her breath, but she didn't step back. She knew that silence could be more powerful than shouting, because it exposed the weakness of those trying to impose control. Her eyes locked on Kane, calm yet chilling, as if to say she had seen this kind of contempt too many times before and would not bow to it ever again. The harsh sunlight cast their shadows on the pavement, one tall and menacing, the other small but unshaken. The scene left witnesses breathless, like watching a fire pulled so tight that the slightest twitch could make it snap, dragging everyone into the storm with it. Car horns still echoed down the street, hurried footsteps of people too afraid to stop kept moving, but in the space where Rosa and Kane stood, time felt frozen. Kane's cruel words still hung in the air when Rosa's gaze swept over it with an icy calm, smothering the city's usual noise. No one knew what would happen next, but everyone sensed something gathering quietly, waiting for a reason to erupt. The one holding the phone kept recording, the frame trembling with his pulse, as if fear gripped him too, but he forced himself to hold on, unwilling to miss this moment. That moment on the surface was just an old woman being blocked, an officer venting rage, but in truth it was the start of a chain of events. Each hateful word struck the pride of those watching, and that calm, piercing stare reached into a pain long buried by generations. On the sunlit pavement, the two figures stood as opposites on one side, power cloaked in arrogance on the other, resilience forged through a lifetime of endurance. The contrast felt like fire meeting wind quiet, but ready to blaze into an inferno with only the smallest spark. In that tense moment, Kane curled his lip, his eyes narrowing as if trying to crush the calm in Rosa's gaze. He stepped forward, his hot breath laced with tobacco blowing into her face, pushing her to retreat. But Rosa stood her ground, her feet firmly planted on the scorching pavement. She didn't need to shout, didn't need to argue. The silence and her stare alone thickened the air like a thin mist wrapping around them both. The crowd began to fall quiet. A few clenched their fists. Others shivered slightly, and everyone understood this moment would not end with just words. It would go further, far beyond what anyone could predict. And then, in the suffocating heat of noon, in a street once loud but now frozen still, the clash had already planted the seed of a storm. An old woman standing tall with a piercing gaze, a snarling officer baring his teeth in a camera lens capturing every frame. Just one more second, and everything would explode, and this street would never be the same again. The main intersection in the commercial district seemed to choke as the red light came on. Lines of cars stood still on the burning pavement. The sluggish rumble of engines, the blaring of horns, and the scuffle of footsteps all blended into a noisy background that still couldn't drown out the scene unfolding on the sidewalk. People turned their heads in the same direction, eyes filled with surprise, irritation, and a hint of fear. Many who were rushing to work or hurrying to make an appointment stopped short at the sight of a towering police officer gripping the wrist of a frail old woman. The entire flow of pedestrians and traffic felt bound by an invisible force. No one moved, no one spoke right away because the tension was too thick, too unnatural. Kane tightened his rough grip around Rosa's wrist, his veined fingers squeezing the wrinkled skin until her small hand seemed to vanish inside the cold strength of his own. He pressed down, forcing her to stop under the weight of dozens of staring eyes. The veins pulsed at his temple, his eyes flared, and his shout burst like a hammer strike. "Take a good look, a stinking old black woman. The only place for her is a rotten care home." Each word slapped the crowd in the face, making some visibly flinch. The insult wasn't just directed at a weak, elderly woman. It struck directly at the pride of an entire community held in contempt. The sound spread, echoing across the intersection, and even those inside their cars lifted their heads to look. Some drivers rolled down their windows, frowned, and looked on. Others raised their phones to capture the moment. The clicks of the phone cameras mingled with low murmurs. The old woman still stood there, her wrist clamped tightly, but Rosa didn't scream, didn't panic. She drew a deep breath, pushed the pain deep into her chest, then replied with a hoarse but firm voice like a blade cutting through arrogance. "A badge doesn't prove dignity. It only exposes cowardice when you insult old age." Her words weren't loud. They didn't need to be be eloquent, but they hit like a slap across the face of false pride dressed in uniform. Kane froze for a brief moment, chest rising and falling at her reply. He wasn't used to this calm resistance, wasn't used to someone he saw as beneath him, looking him in the eye and speaking words that weighed like lead. His lips twitched for a second, then the sneer returned to smirk full of threat and mockery. The crowd began to stir. Voices broke through like a wave. Let her go. This time it wasn't a whisper. It was a collective voice, clear and forceful. A young woman clutched her handbag, eyes burning with fury, and shouted again. Let her go. You can't do this. The cry bounced back through many voices, blending into one heavy chorus of defiance. The intersection, once noisy with traffic, was now drowned out by the wave of resistance, making even the blinding midday sun seem to dim. People inside cars leaned fully out to watch, their focused gazes forming an invisible circle around the two central figures. Dozens of phones rose in unison, lenses pointed straight at Kane, recording every move of his rough hands and his sneering, wrinkled face. He glanced around, eyes flashing with hostility as he realized he had become the center of attention. But Kane did not back down, showing no sign of softening his aggression. He drove all his weight into one finger, pointing it straight at the old woman's face, his lips curling into a wicked arc. Voice spat out bitter and proud, "Here I am, the law. Anyone defending her gets cuffed now." The words had barely dropped when the entire space seemed to collapse a level. Shouts of anger burst out, crowding the thick air. A middle-aged man exclaimed, "What kind of law beats up an old woman?" A young girl began crying, her sobs tangled with the rising shouts. Camera shutters kept clicking, shaky recordings continued capturing every second, every movement, every expression on Kane and Rosa's faces, locked into hundreds of phones. Everyone knew by now, every word he said, every move he made could become evidence, could spread like fire in a storm. Rosa remained silent after her reply, her eyes digging deeper into Kane's face. She didn't bow, didn't flinch, didn't tremble, even as her wrist reddened under his grip. The crowd saw her calm and grew even angrier because the contrast between her small but unwavering presence and his violent arrogance pressed injustice heavily on their chests. Someone had called for another police unit. Someone else muttered, "Does he really think the world will stay silent?" The voices grew little sparks waiting to catch flame. The harsh sunlight beat down on Kane's face, turning it red, sweat trickling past his temples, but doing nothing to cool his aggression. He knew he was being watched, but instead of restraining himself, he seemed to revel in it, basking in the sense of standing above others, feeding on the fear around him. He wanted to turn this intersection into a stage to display his power, to make people believe he was the law, that he could do anything. But what he failed to see was that the moment he said, "I am the law," was the moment he stripped away the mask, revealing the brute force beneath laid bare for a furious crowd to witness. The entire space felt ready to explode. On one side, a police officer gripping power in his rough hand; on the other, an old woman standing tall within a circle of watching eyes. The sounds of cars, voices, and pounding hearts blended into a heavy, chaotic noise, making people feel like they were trapped inside a room too small. The air sucked out, leaving only thick tension. That intersection in this moment was no longer just a place to pass through. It had become an arena where every gaze waited for the next strike, where silent outrage was sealed inside each word, each glance. And while Kane still sneered, thinking he was winning, the truth was that he had already pushed himself to the edge of a storm fiercer than anything he had ever faced. A sudden gust swept through the sweltering intersection, lifting a crumpled newspaper someone had left on a stone bench. The torn sheet floated just above people's heads, spinning in the air. In that instant, the city noise seemed to stretch thin. The car horns, the murmuring conversations, even the hurried footsteps all faded, leaving behind a silence so sharp it felt unreal. The crowd seemed to hold its breath, all eyes locked on the two figures facing each other, Rosa frail but unyielding, and Kane towering with a face flushed red from rage and pride. The air thickened like an invisible sheet of glass, wrapping the entire intersection waiting to shatter. Kane clenched his jaw, the muscles in his face twitching with pressure, his eyes wild with a brutal gleam. His voice growled out, each word landing like a hammer. "You trash! Get off my street!" The shout ripped through the silence, and in the beat of the next heart, his fist shot forward. No warning, no pause, just a strike as heavy as a steel hammer crashing into Rosa's face. The sound of impact cracked through the air, dry and violent, as if even the pavement itself recoiled from the blow. Rosa's small body jerked backward, collapsing onto the gray concrete. Blood burst from the corner of her mouth, streaking across the road in a red smear that stood out horrifically against the bright sun. In the ears of those watching came the soft clink of a tiny metal piece. The golden earring that flew from her ear rolled across the ground, spun once, then lay still, glinting with the cold light. The sight made several people cover their mouths, some gasped, others trembled and dropped their phones. No one could believe it. In broad daylight in a crowded street, a police officer had just punched an elderly woman in the face. A young man at the front of the crowd, the same one who had kept recording, screamed from the top of his lungs, "Oh my God, he knocked her out." His voice echoed, bouncing off tall buildings, making the whole intersection seem to tremble. That scream was like a match thrown into a drum of fuel, turning the tense silence into a wave of fury. People started shouting, cries of protest filled the air, and many raised their phones higher, swaying to catch every angle. The look toward Kane shifted from shock to fury, from fear to resolve. The phone shook in the young man's hand, but he kept the frame steady. The image captured Kane's fist, still raised, his face twisted in malice. Rosa collapsed at his feet, blood soaking into the concrete, her earring gleaming beside her, all of it locked inside the shot. Just 1 second earlier, it had been a scene of verbal threat, but the next second it became undeniable evidence of a brutal act of violence. The lens trembled with the heartbeat of the one filming, but that very trembling made the footage feel alive, painfully real. Viewers would later feel not only the event itself, but the fear and fury that swept through the street in that exact moment. Rosa's face, even as she fell, remained open-eyed, her gaze dimmed but unbroken. In the brief instant before unconsciousness, those eyes still held a quiet light, a final act of resistance against the savage blow. That image burned into the crowd's memory, becoming something no one could forget. Her hand trembled slightly, fingers dragging weakly through the bloodstain, searching for support, then stopped right beside her golden earring. That very moment pushed the crowd's outrage to its peak. This was no longer a distant scene, pain that belonged to their own families, their own community. Kane stepped half a pace back, panting, his face flushed with adrenaline. The corner of his mouth curled into a cruel smile. There was no regret, only a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes that made him all the more vile. He believed the punch would silence the crowd, would spark fear, but he failed to see that it had done the opposite. The crowd no longer buzzed in hesitation. They shouted, voices rising from every direction into a wave. A few stepped forward, met with Kane's fierce glare, but they didn't back down. The young woman who had earlier screamed for Rosa's release now sobbed openly, clutching her chest as if the punch had struck her own heart. Among the gathering mass, someone had already called other police. Someone else opened social media and went live. Frantic captions appeared on the screen. Police officer punches elderly woman in public. What was happening wasn't staying here. It had started spreading beyond through every phone in sight. All eyes turned to Kane, filled with fury, turning him from a man who thought he held power into one already standing trial in the court of public outrage. The sunlit intersection now felt engulfed in fire. The fire of anger, the fire of justice, betrayed the fire of a community no longer willing to stay silent. Cain still stood tall, but the air around him had changed. It was no longer fear, it was rage closing in, ready to erupt. And Rosa, the woman who had fallen, lay in her blood, her golden earring shining beside her. That image would become a lasting symbol, not only for those who saw it unfold today, but for the millions who would later witness it through the shaky footage that captured everything. In that moment, the city was no longer its usual noise and bustle, but a stage where truth stood bare and undeniable. Cain's heavy punch did not land on just an old woman. It struck at the very trust of an entire community, turning this place into the starting point of an unprecedented storm of outrage. And everything, the scream, the blood on the concrete, the earring spinning on the ground, became proof of a fateful punch whose consequences would reach far beyond anything Cain had ever imagined. Car horns from all four directions collided, harsh, erratic, and relentless to the point of suffocation. Each blaring note slammed down like a hammer on air, already thick with tension after the brutal punch, making the entire intersection seem to tremble. Vehicles lined up in gridlock beneath the scorching sun drivers, rolled down windows, leaned out, frowning and squinting their faces, a mix of heat and outrage at the scene unfolding. On the sidewalk, Rosa lay motionless, her frail body curled like a dried leaf swept by wind, her thin hand twitching weakly as if grasping at the air for something to hold on to. Blood still trickled from the corner of her mouth, spreading across the gray cement, the red vivid under the noon light, painful and blinding, seared into the eyes of anyone who saw it. People gathered around, some with hands over their mouths, others stepping back in shock. The horror was too clear, too raw, and their hearts pounded faster beneath the weight of it. Amid the rising tension, a middle-aged woman suddenly broke through the crowd and rushed forward, panic written across her face. Her expression mixed fear with fierce resolve, hands trembling yet firm as she reached to touch Rosa's shoulder, trying to lift her. The act came from compassion, but also a deep instinct to protect someone who shared her struggle. Before her hands could settle, her body was thrown backward by a violent shove. Officer Cain, the same one who had dropped Rosa with a punch, roared like an enraged beast. "Back off. Anyone who touches her goes in the trunk." His voice cracked each word like metal scraping metal. The woman screamed as she hit the ground, her hand scraping along the rough pavement, leaving a long, bloody scratch. A little girl, standing nearby, witnessing the fall and hearing the crash, burst into sobs, her cry cutting through the chaos and making heads whip around in alarm. That moment struck like a spark on gasoline, and the fury, long pent up inside the crowd, ignited. A young man, his face flushed with rage, stepped forward and shouted across the intersection, "A man punches an old woman. Is that what you call order?" The scream hit like a firework in the crowd, unleashing a flood that shattered the silence held since Rosa collapsed. His cry wasn't just a question. It was a direct accusation hurled at the man blocking the sidewalk with shameless arrogance. The sound echoed, bouncing off the glass walls of nearby shops, coming back in waves of anger, making the street thrum with the pulse of revolt. Shouts of protest began to rise, at first scattered, then building, swelling into a deep, echoing wave. An older man near the back growled, "This is justice." A young woman, eyes red and hands trembling, still held her phone high, crying as she shouted, "Look at this! He just punched an old woman." More and more voices joined in, a layer upon layer, blending with the car horns, children's cries, camera shutters, and recording sounds. The crowd began to press forward, people who had hesitated now stepping fully onto the sidewalk, forming a tight ring around the scene. But Cain still did not back down. He stood tall, as if the world owed him obedience. His face was flushed, sweat rolled down his temples, but his eyes remained sharp, trying to crush the crowd with sheer force. He swept his gaze across every face, warning that anyone who dared step closer would pay. But what he saw was no longer fear. The eyes that had once flinched were now burning with fury, looks as sharp as blades fixed on him. The circle tightened in silence, no one speaking, only heavy breaths and the boiling rage about to break free. That silence was not surrender. It was a verdict without words, a rope pulling tighter around the arrogant officer. The flag, hanging near a storefront, fluttered in the breeze, sunlight casting long shadows across the pavement. The child kept crying, its sobs echoing and deepening the ache in everyone who heard. The woman Kane had shoved struggled upright, clutching her scraped arm, her eyes blazing with fury, wrapped in helplessness. A few men on the outer edge clenched their fists, exchanging glances, charged with resolve as if one nod would be enough to launch them forward regardless of consequence. Young people holding phones raised their cameras higher, the red lights of recording mode blinking in Kane's eyes like dozens of second pairs of eyes watching his every move, every motion. Every drop of sweat, every word he spoke was now locked in a lens, turning him into a man on trial right there in the street. Rosa still lay on the pavement, her eyes half closed, her trembling hand twitching as if trying to grasp something solid in the chaos. The image chilled many, not just as the pain of one person, but as a symbol of a whole community being trampled. People began shouting now, not whispers, not fear, but sharp ringing cries that echoed across the intersection. Each voice was an accusation, each breath a spark tearing through the pride of the man standing shamelessly before them. The air grew so heavy, it felt like each person could hear their heartbeat pulsing with the rising murmur of outrage. The intersection, once just a place to wait for a green light, had become an arena where power-dressed individuals in police uniforms stood face to face with collective resistance. In that moment, the stifling heat seemed to be replaced by the fire of anger, rising fast. Everyone knew this chaos would not end here. It was only the beginning of a storm that would sweep through the entire city. Kane still believed he held control, but the truth was that the silent circle and the burning stairs had already made him the one on trial, right there in the sun-drenched intersection, thick with the metallic scent of blood. The scene felt like a living film, and everyone present was a witness. Every detail was etched deep into memory. Rosa lying still in a pool of blood, her hand twitching the woman who had been shoved, clutching her bleeding arm, the lonely cries of a child, the rising shouts of protest, and the eyes of hundreds locked on one man. Chaos was no longer a threat on the horizon. It had already erupted, and there was no turning back. The wail of an ambulance siren rose from a distance, growing louder as it blended with the crowd's shouts and the harsh blaring of car horns still trapped in the intersection. Red and blue lights flashed across glass windows, swept over bloodshot, furious eyes, and lit up the cold face of the officer standing motionless at the center of it all. As the ambulance sped onto the scene, the packed crowd instinctively parted, forming a narrow path. The flashing lights turned the street into an unwilling stage where every character was already in place. At the center of the circle, Rosa lay still on the scorching pavement, blood seeping from the corner of her mouth, lips, pale skin drained of color. People held their breath as two medics rushed down with the stretcher and emergency gear. They knelt beside her, placed a stethoscope on her chest, and exchanged urgent looks. No one could hear what they said, but their expressions alone made clear how critical the situation was. A chill passed through the crowd as Rosa was gently lifted onto the stretcher. Her eyes remained closed, lashes fluttering faintly, like she was struggling against a dark tide pulling her under. Her hand dangled trembling softly, too weak to hold on. Those watching stood frozen, some clutched their heads, others began to cry. An elderly man whispered, "She's not gonna make it." The words sent shivers through the group, not just because they were grim, but because they named a fear everyone had felt hanging in the air. The image of an old woman struck down in a crowded street, now lying motionless on an ambulance stretcher, turned every ounce of anger into a sharp cut through the heart of the community. While the ambulance lights continued to flash, the breathless crowd watched in silence. Officer Kane stood with arms crossed, chest puffed out, lips curling into a smug grin. His voice cut through the moment like a bucket of cold water. One old lady, passes out, and the whole street then turns into a circus. He didn't speak loudly, but those nearby heard him clearly, and the phones held high captured every word. The sentence landed like a stone in the still water, sending ripples of outrage through the crowd. People looked at each other, stunned and furious. One person shouted straight at him, "He's not worthy of the badge." A young woman sobbed, voice shaken. "What if that was my mother?" Cries of protest swelled again, mixing with the ambulance siren into a chaotic, thunderous roar that made the whole intersection tremble. At the front line, the young man who had been recording from the start kept his phone up his face, tense, eyes locked on the screen. His hand trembled, but he refused to stop capturing every detail: the punch, the collapse, the spreading blood, the emergency response, and now the cold face and cutting words of the officer. Just seconds after Rosa was placed on the stretcher, he opened a social media app and typed quickly with fingers shaking from anger, "Police punched an elderly woman unconscious." The video was uploaded instantly, and within moments, dozens of notifications appeared. Angry reaction icons flooded the screen, and shares spiked in the span of a few breaths. He took a long breath, trying to steady himself, then raised his phone again, knowing this was not the end. It was only the beginning of something far bigger. In the crowd, several eyes suddenly stopped on a tiny object glinting in the sun. It was Rosa's gold earring, the simple piece of jewelry she wore every day, now knocked loose in her violent fall, rolling a few times before lying still on the burning pavement. The light bouncing off it flashed small, but haunting, like a silent reminder that this was not just a random incident. A boy nearby bent down to pick it up, but his hand froze midair, and he whispered with a shaky voice, "Leave it, people need to see it." Cameras quickly turned toward the tiny detail, and no one expected that this earring would become a symbol, a mark tied forever to a truth that could not be denied. As the ambulance slowly raised the stretcher, the entire crowd followed with their eyes like flickering flames. Some people ran alongside to keep filming Rosa being taken away, and others shouted for more police to come to the scene. The air felt thick and heavy, pressing down on every breath. Kane's words, his expression, and the image of Rosa unconscious had already cut deep, leaving wounds that would not heal easily. Red and blue lights from the ambulance flickered across people's faces, revealing expressions of rage, pain, worry, and defiance. Together, they created a living film, and everyone in it knew they were now witnesses to a truth that could no longer be hidden. In that moment, as the ambulance pulled away, its siren fading but still echoing, the crowd did not disperse. They stood, firm eyes locked on Kane, who remained at the center, still with that cold and defiant posture. He thought arrogance could suppress everything, but the furious stares around him said otherwise. The entire street felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for what came next. Rosa was gone, but the image of red blood on concrete, the gold earring under the sun, and the cruel words of the man in power had been burned into everyone's mind, ready to ignite a storm no one could stop. The sound of the ambulance siren had faded into the distance, but its echo lingered like an undertow in the crowd's chest. They hadn't dispersed. Many still stood at the intersection, eyes fixed in the direction the vehicle had gone, where Rosa now lay unconscious, her life hanging by a thread. The bloodstain still marked the pavement red and raw beneath the harsh midday sun searing into memory. People felt anger and helplessness in equal measure, but in that very moment, something else had begun, quieter yet fiercer than any scream, an uprising on social media. From the first seconds, Rosa collapsed and was lifted onto the stretcher. Dozens of nearby phones had already captured everything. The shaky frames, the shouting in the background, the fury in people's eyes, nothing was lost. And, without waiting for the crowd to collect itself with just a few taps, the video was posted, shared, and spread at staggering speed. On tiny screens everywhere, the chaos in the street, the fateful punch, Kane's twisted smile, and Rosa's motionless body all swirled together, carrying a weight no one could ignore. In a coffee shop near a university, once just a student meetup spot, the mood had been swallowed by suffocating silence. On every table, cups of steaming coffee, sat untouched books left half read, but every pair of eyes was locked onto phone screens. Some hands trembled, some lips drew blood from biting down, and others cursed aloud as Kane's fist hit Rosa's face. The video was no longer a clip, it had become evidence, a living accusation. With each replay, the screams returned, the blood on concrete appeared again. The gold earring rolled across the street like a blade through the mind. The video's spread had long escaped the bounds of a single neighborhood. It burst outward like fire catching wind. Within minutes, it was in dozens of group chats, leaping beyond the student crowd and into the timelines of people who had never even set foot on that street. The more it was watched, the wider the fury grew. The share and comment counts climbed every second like the heartbeat of a society exploding in unison. One comment pinned beneath the video made the whole coffee shop fall silent. "My mom just got admitted to the hospital." My hands shook when I saw her face. A short sentence, but it held a pain no explanation could soften. It was pinned immediately, gaining thousands of likes and hundreds of replies. Others added, "If that were my mother, I'd never forgive. We can't let people like him wear a badge. Justice cannot be trampled like this." Every line was another spark, feeding the fire rising fast across the city. On phone screens everywhere, hashtags began to appear at first, just a few scattered across some posts, then flooding in. Justice for Rosa and Hatch Kane. The abuser became the banners of outrage. They shot to the trending list in record time, taking over every platform from Facebook and Twitter to Instagram and TikTok. Every post, every short clip, every photo of the moment Rosa collapsed came with those hashtags, forming a roaring current that swept away every effort to hide or justify what had happened. In the cafe, young students spoke in rapid bursts, no longer able to keep their composure. One girl burst into tears after reading a confession from an older man. "I stayed silent when I saw something like this years ago. I won't stay silent today." The words made her hands tremble, tears rolling down her cheeks, and then she looked up, her voice unsteady. "We can't stay silent either." People around her nodded, some clenched their fists. Others opened their apps on the spot to share the video with their own calls to action. Frames from the video were clipped, zoomed in, and edited into countless versions. Some focused only on Kane's punch, others only on Rosa's collapsing face. Others looped the moment her earring hit the pavement as an eerie reminder. Every version was shared hundreds of thousands of times, set to pounding background music with bold red captions, "Big mistake." Viewers weren't just watching, they were feeling it, reliving the anger as if they had stood on that street themselves. Outside the cafe, inside dorm rooms and small offices and cramped apartments, millions of eyes were fixed on screens. They shared, they commented, they called for action. The young spoke in sharp, urgent language. The old wrote long, tearful paragraphs. But they all converged at the same point: rage, sorrow, and a demand for justice. In that digital space, the loneliness of one elderly woman had become the strength of millions. The online uproar was no longer a collection of fragmented voices, it had become a firestorm. From one shaky phone video, a movement was forming. Each new post was a spark, each hashtag a chant, each comment a strike against the wall of denial. Rosa, the frail woman on the stretcher, had become a symbol of pain and resistance. And Kane, the man who stood with arms crossed and a smirk in the street, had become a name the internet condemned, a villain no one could defend. In less than an hour, the storm had crossed city limits. The news spread to other states, then appeared on national media outlets, but it all began with posts, comments, and hashtags burning red on screens. From a small cafe, from thousands of private rooms, from countless hearts beating in sync, Rosa had become the center of a wave like no other. And once that flame had ignited, it would not stay confined to the digital world, it would spill into real life, becoming a force that pressured the entire system to face itself. In that moment, the students sitting in the cafe understood they were not just spectators. They were part of the storm drops of water in a rising wave. Rosa was no longer a distant name. She was the face of justice, knocked down a reminder that silence never protects anyone. And from one shaky video, from one blazing hashtag, an entire society had been awakened, bracing for a whirlwind that could no longer be reversed. After social media exploded with viral videos and spreading hashtags, the wave of outrage could no longer be contained in comment sections. Major news outlets quickly took notice. Reporters, already on alert for city stories, rushed to the intersection where it all happened. They gathered witness accounts, interviewed bystanders, and within hours the footage had been edited into news segments airing during prime time. On television screens in millions of homes, the first image wasn't the usual string of ads, it was the stifling street scene where an elderly woman was struck down by a police officer's punch. Inside the newsroom, the air felt dense, as if the lights, cameras, and tense faces all shared the same weight. The anchor looked straight into the lens, voice low and grave. One punch shattered the line between doubt and truth. The opening line cut through the silence, hitting millions watching at home. For so long, viewers had grown used to dry headlines, but tonight they were shown raw proof, no longer hidden, no longer vague. The moment Rosa collapsed onto the pavement, the blood splattered the earring, glinting under sunlight, the crowd's scream, all replayed in slow motion, each detail magnified, leaving even the most skeptical viewers shaken. The story didn't stop with the video. Journalists quickly dug into Rosa's background. They found the small home where she lived, spoke to neighbors, and uncovered long-forgotten stories. By the end of that same afternoon, the public learned that Rosa had once been a volunteer teacher running free classes for homeless children for many years. Old photos aired her standing by a chalkboard, smiling gently, holding a piece of chalk in thin fingers. One child, now grown, returned to speak on live TV. "If it weren't for her, I probably wouldn't know how to read. She treated us like her own kids." The words were simple, but honest, moving many viewers to tears. Reporters also captured the voices of residents. A middle-aged woman stared into the camera with teary eyes. "She's the heart of this neighborhood." An elderly man nodded, eyes red. "Everyone knows. Rosa shared every loaf of bread, every can of milk with the kids. She never hurt a soul in her life." These words needed no polish. They painted a vivid contrast to the arrogance of Officer Kane. That contrast only deepened as the broadcast cut between Rosa's kind smile in a classroom and her collapsed body on the hard pavement, blood pooling. The pain of that contrast turned the incident from a violent outburst into a social tragedy, forcing viewers to confront the meaning of justice. In the evening news broadcast, Kane's image appeared in stark detail. A close-up of his face, eyes bloodshot, fist still raised, was overlaid with bold red letters, "Big mistake." The phrase filled the screen and quickly spread across digital news sites, television reports, and online magazine covers. Just 3 words, but enough to capture the arrogance, recklessness, and consequence Kane had brought upon himself. People talked about it, reposted it, added it to countless posts, turning "big mistake" into an unofficial slogan repeated like a collective social verdict. Each broadcast frame, every interview, and constant updates turned the incident into a national focus. In restaurants, people paused mid-meal to look at wall-mounted TVs discussing what they were seeing. In small apartments, families gathered in front of their televisions, parents pointing at the screen and quietly telling their children that must never be allowed to happen. On subway trains, people passed around papers with photos of Rosa and Kane. The atmosphere as tense as a trial unfolding in public. Meanwhile, inside newsrooms, phones rang non-stop, emails poured in, and editors typed until their hands were sore. New articles were pushed out one after another, each offering a new angle, but all centered around one name, Rosa Johnson. Journalists no longer kept their distance. They joined in, directly telling her story as if recounting the legacy of an entire community. They had no hesitation naming Officer Kane, no fear in calling it what it was: violence and a disgrace to the badge he wore. Amid that overwhelming flow of coverage, the public stepped in. They didn't just read or watch, they began to write. Letters flooded into editorial desks, and people shared personal stories of injustice they had faced. A wave of memory surged back, posted alongside Rosa's case, turning her story from an isolated event into a sweeping indictment of the system itself. And so the press did what social media had begun. They brought truth into the light, shaped Rosa into a symbol of compassion, exposed Kane as the face of brutality, and turned the incident into a national reckoning. As the news segment ended, the anchor bowed his head, speaking slowly. "This story cannot be buried." A pause followed, then conversation returned louder than before, as if the whole nation was preparing for a confrontation that could no longer be avoided. That night, as newsrooms stayed lit and television stations replayed the footage again and again, the public understood they were witnessing a turning point. An elderly woman with gold earrings had become a symbol, and one punch had become a moment of reckoning, forcing the system to face itself. From now on, this story would not just live in the news, it had become a challenge, a public indictment society had chosen to deliver together. In front of the police headquarters, a place usually quiet with a few officers passing through and a handful of patrol cars in the lot, had suddenly become the high of a social storm. Crowds poured in from every direction, groups of students, entire families, elderly people leaning on canes, young activists holding handmade signs. No official call was needed. After one night of nonstop news and video sharing, thousands had gathered. They filled the street in front of the building, spilled onto the sidewalks, blocked passing cars, becoming a sea of unrest. Overhead, the blazing sun beat down, thickening the air, but no one backed away. Together, they chanted, "Justice for Rosa." The cries bounced off the stone walls of the building, booming like war drums, sending chills through everyone standing inside the circle. The chants didn't stop. They rose, then fell, pulsing like the breath of a massive body. Many raised signs drawn with the image of a gold earring lying on the pavement beneath it in bold red letters, "Big Mistake." On a large screen set up in the square, the video of Officer Kane's punch played again and again. No effects were needed, no narration, just the savage face, falling fist, Rosa collapsing, blood spreading, the earring flying loose. That alone was enough to trigger 1,000 voices to scream in unison. The roar mixed with speakers replaying Kane's insulting word. Every time they echoed, the crowd howled back, turning the entire atmosphere into a public courtroom with thousands of witnesses rising to testify. Inside the station, curtains were drawn tight, but the silhouettes moving behind the glass couldn't hide the tension. Some officers peeked out their eyes uneasy, knowing that silence would not make this fury go away. Outside, megaphones passed from hand to hand, voices taking turns. A student with a trembling but determined voice spoke, "We're not here to cause chaos. We're here to say that justice cannot be twisted. Rosa is not just an old woman. She is a mother, a grandmother to all of us." The crowd erupted in support, cheer, and chants, thundering together, the rhythm of fury making the ground seem to shake beneath their feet. The air was already boiling when a murmur rose from the back of the crowd. People turned their heads, phones lifted higher. From inside the police headquarters, Officer Kane suddenly appeared. He wore a crisp uniform, his badge gleaming under the sun, and his face still showed traces of red from the past tense days. But the moment he stepped out, a wave of fury surged forward. The crowd roared, hundreds, thousands of voices tearing through the air. Arms shot upward, fingers pointed straight at him like invisible spears. From somewhere, a water bottle flew spinning through the air, midair before landing near his polished shoes, splashing droplets across the ground. Kane flinched, a flicker of fear flashing in his eyes, but he quickly tried to recover, stood tall, chin raised. The crowd didn't back off. They surged forward, screams shaking the space. Signs were lifted higher. Phones recorded his every move. Someone shouted, "Take off the badge!" The reply echoed instantly from hundreds of voices. Another yelled, "Bring the cuffs," and when the third voice rang out, "Give us justice!" the sea of people erupted. The three-part chant rang out sharp and thunderous, repeating endlessly, "Take the badge, bring the cuffs, give us justice." With each beat, thousands of arms shot up in unison, forming a wall of people, unified, relentless, and fierce. The sound pierced every window pane, pounding into the heart of the station. Officers, peeking from behind curtains, quickly shut them, but they couldn't keep the chants from reaching every corner. Inside, commanding officers grew uneasy sweat, forming on their brows. They knew this was no longer a mere gathering, it was a public storm. Kane stood his ground, but the usual smug smile was gone, replaced by a rigid face and clenched jaw. He could no longer deny it. The crowd had made him the symbol of their rage, the man now judged by the entire community. Within the mass, many began live streaming. Tens of thousands tuned in, commenting, posting angry emojis, and sharing slogans. The phrase, "Justice for Rosa," flooded every screen, merging with the real life chants to create one unified sound. National TV crews arrived, cameras rolling, capturing the packed crowd, fluttering flags, red banners, and the roar of a public rising. On the giant screen in front of the station, Kane's close-up appeared alongside the video of his punch. The side-by-side image formed a living indictment, fueling the fury of every person in that square. The three-beat chant echoed endlessly, the sound bouncing off the walls, reverberating from the sky, turning into chilling soundtrack for the day. Kane tried to maintain a tough stance, but his eyes kept darting around and his shoulders trembled slightly. He knew he was no longer in control, and in the eyes of thousands, the badge on his chest had become nothing more than a meaningless piece of metal, a symbol of deceit. The crowd inched closer, the space between the two sides shrinking, tension pulled tight like a string about to snap. That day in front of the police station, the fire of anger became a sea of flames. The chant, "Take the badge, bring the cuffs, give us justice," sounded like a collective sentence, roaring from thousands of throats, cutting through every boundary, etching into everyone's memory that the storm of justice had truly ignited and could no longer be extinguished. The university auditorium, once echoing with dry lectures, had today become a flashpoint, a space thick with urgency pressing down on every seat. Students filled the hall from front to back. Many stood in the aisles, holding phones already playing the video of the Fateful Punch, their eyes tense and focused. On stage, the microphone at the center table stood like a bridge, connecting hundreds of hearts burning with outrage. Into that charged silence, a young female student stepped forward, her hair disheveled from crying, her hands gripping her notes, but when her voice broke free, it rang out, "I saw my mother in Mrs. Rosa." The words echoed short but powerful enough to plunge the entire hall into silence. Her tears fell, her red eyes cast downward toward the seats, and anyone listening felt as if a blade had been dragged across their chest. The quiet hung for a moment, then wave after wave of applause erupted, strong, insistent, mixed with muffled sobs. Empathy spread like fire, students bowing their heads to wipe tears, some clutching each other's hands as if to anchor themselves. Among the crowd, a middle-aged man suddenly stood back, straight eyes blazing under the lights. He wore plain clothes, but his voice carried a force that made the room fall silent again. "I made sacrifices only to see the police hit an old woman." The question cracked through the air like thunder, heavy jarring. Paused, swept his gaze across the crowd, and continued, his voice firmer. I once stood on the battlefield thinking I was protecting freedom, defending dignity. But today, I have to witness an elderly woman struck down in the street. His words reignited the already heavy air into a fierce blaze. Hundreds of hands shot into the air, applause thundered like a storm, and voices rose calling Rosa's name, a collective vow that she was not alone. The young woman who had been crying stepped aside, her eyes now burning with resolve, while the veteran remained standing like a living monument, a reminder that today's pain did not belong only to the young, but also carved deep into those who had once given their lives in service. The auditorium was no longer a place for study, it had become a forum, a front line where justice was shouted with voices and tears. Every clap, every unflinching word became a weapon carrying the flames from the streets into the halls, fueling a movement that had grown into an unstoppable wave. In that moment, it became clear that the outrage wasn't confined to a video or limited to protests outside the police station. It had spread into every lecture hall, into the heart of a generation. The voices in the auditorium were not just emotional outbursts, they were pledges to never stay silent. The veteran's question, the young woman's trembling words, the unified applause had become a new symphony, echoing beyond the four walls, joining the chants rising across the nation. And as phones across the room went live streaming images of this urgent gathering, the entire country and even the world could feel that the storm named Rosa was spreading fiercer than ever. The first applause rang out softly from a few rows in front, then surged like a rising tide, flooding the vast auditorium. It grew louder, faster, fused with shouts of anger and unresolved sobs. No one needed cues, no one waited for instruction. Hundreds stood as one hand's clapping until they stung voices raised as if to turn the tears just shed into declarations. Justice for Rosa echoed from the student seats, followed by "We will not be silent," and then "End the violence." Each chant repeated, layered, forming a fierce rhythm that seemed to shake the walls. The veteran still stood among them, eyes blazing, hand raised in unity, and the young woman who had wept now held her head high, shouting with her friends. In that moment, the auditorium ceased to be a classroom. It had transformed into a miniature square where collective resolve was forged loud and clear. As the applause faded, the atmosphere remained thick with determination. A group of students quickly stepped onto the stage, setting up a temporary live mic. Light from raised phones lit their faces, capturing every word like a vow. One student declared, "From today on, we are no longer bystanders. We are witnesses. We are the voice." That sentence made the hall erupt again, thunderous clapping bouncing off the walls. That collective pledge wasn't written on paper. It needed no stamp or signature, but it rang out with the power of unified conviction of hundreds of voices becoming one shared vow. In that moment, every face shone with resolve, and everyone knew they were stepping into a battle that wouldn't be easy, but from which there was no turning back. Outside, the afternoon sun tilted to gold, its light filtering through the tall windows, reflecting the scene within. One by one, students raised their phones to live stream on social media platforms. The shaky cameras still captured every chant, every clap, every blazing stare and clenched fist. These live streams quickly spilled beyond the auditorium, weaving into news feeds and personal timelines, allowing tens of thousands more to witness the moment as it happened. The footage wasn't polished. There was no professional lighting, but its rawness made it undeniable. Viewers felt like they were standing there too, clapping, chanting, trembling with both fury and resolve. Within hours, the student assembly clip spread at breakneck speed. It appeared across personal pages, community groups, and quickly climbed to the top of trending charts. Online media didn't stop at reposting. They trimmed the video, looped the collective chants, and added subtitles so that everyone anyone could understand, the university auditorium had become the voice of a generation. The image of hundreds of students clapping in unison and chanting was spliced with footage of Rosa lying unconscious, creating a powerful video that brought millions to tears and compelled them to share. This is the power of youth. This is the voice society needs to hear. Captions like these flooded every repost, pushing the video's reach beyond control. Social pressure surged directly from this wave. Television commentators began quoting the clip, stressing that the students' voices had transcended the classroom. They had become the voices of citizens. Politicians, professors, and activists joined in, many writing that they saw their own youth reflected in that fervent hall. Collective power doubled as it became clear that it wasn't just the young people inside the room. Millions outside had joined in turning the event into a nationwide declaration. Conversations erupted, calls to action grew louder, and there was a mounting insistence that Rosa's case must not fade into silence, that the thunderous applause from that day must be followed by real action. In less than a day, what began as a student meeting to express outrage had become a national focal point, a testament that when a community stands united, it can turn pain into strength, capable of shaking an entire system. The hospital room was cold and sterile, as if a thin layer of frost had settled over everything in it. The sharp scent of disinfectant clung to every breath, and the harsh fluorescent lights bore down on the bed where Rosa lay motionless. IV tubes pierced her frail arm, each drop falling in a steady rhythm, merging with the cold mechanical beeping of the heart monitor. Her lips were bluish, her face pale, and her eyelashes trembled faintly as though some part of her consciousness was still fighting in the dark. Outside the window, the city remained loud and alive, but inside this room everything was frozen in place. Only the fragility of life and the weight of fear filled the air. A doctor approached, eyes sunken from hours of tense observation, hands gripping a medical file tightly. He lowered his voice to the nurses nearby, yet his words still cut through the silence like a blade. She may never wake up. It wasn't an accusation, but a cold, brutal truth. In that moment, the room, already heavy with worry, seemed to plunge deeper into darkness. A few nurses lowered their heads, some clenched the hems of their uniforms, and others let out quiet sighs. The sentence spread like the toll of a bell, signaling the beginning of a nightmare no one wanted to accept. The door opened softly, and slow, heavy footsteps echoed into the room. A man entered, tall, broad-shouldered, his face, stern eyes burdened with quiet grief. He said nothing to the doctor or nurses, walking straight to the bedside. When his hand took Rosa's cold hand, the contrast was stark, one strong and steady, the other fragile and trembling. He looked down at his unconscious mother, and in that moment every hard layer around him collapsed, revealing the vulnerability buried deep inside. He didn't cry, but his breath shook, his eyes were red, and his silence spoke a pain far louder than any scream. The steady beeping of the monitor sounded like a distant heartbeat, each tone reminding him that time would not wait. He sat down beside her, never letting go of her hand, his large fingers gently stroking the age-marked skin, as if trying to transfer life back into her, as if whispering for her to return. He murmured something, his voice low and lost among the hum of machines, the words unclear, but his gaze was unwavering. He knew the world outside was on fire because of her, but in this cold room all he wanted was a blink, a tiny sign she was still holding on. The darkness in the hospital room was not absolute. It was the kind of darkness that seeped into the hearts of those present, stirring a fear that the brutal truth might become reality. Yet, within that darkness, the image of the man gripping his mother's hand became a beacon. It was not merely the bond between mother and child, but the beginning of a greater force, a power that would soon emerge and shift the entire course of events. Rosa lay in the shadows, but the fire lit from her son's hand had begun to glow, ready to blaze into a torch for a new journey, one filled with fierce resolve and no compromise. In the quiet space of the hospital room where the beeping monitors seemed to echo like heartbeats, a young nurse took a step back, watching the man who had just taken Rosa's hand. The way he bowed his head, the stern look in his eyes, the firm grip, everything about him radiated something uncommon. She whispered to the colleague beside her, voice full of surprise but low enough for no one else to hear. Who is he that, just hearing his name, made Kane go pale? The question hung in the air like a heavy punctuation mark in the cold white room. It wasn't casual curiosity, it was genuine confusion, because in the memory of the hospital staff, no man had ever made an arrogant officer like Kane flinch just by name alone. Curious glances passed silently from doctors to other nurses, all stealing quick looks at the man sitting silently at the bedside. He said nothing, made no attempt to draw attention, yet his silence seemed to cast an invisible aura that thickened the air in the room. Footsteps lingered longer, breaths grew quieter, the entire atmosphere subtly shaped by his presence. Outside, public outrage was boiling, the media kept broadcasting updates, but in this narrow hospital room, the question, "Who is he?" began to spread in hushed tones through the hospital hallways. In a hidden corner, a freelance reporter who had been following the case from the beginning dared to creep closer, his camera tucked beneath his coat, catching a brief flash. He didn't dare photograph directly. He only managed to swing the lens through a door crack to capture the silhouette of the tall man sitting still. The image that emerged was blurred by the harsh lighting, but it revealed a commanding figure, squared shoulders, a posture carved in stone, and a hand resting on Rosa's with strength like a vow. That photo, once it leaked, would become the first clue fueling speculation about the man's true identity. A picture that didn't show his face, but was enough to stir curiosity and ignite a new wave of discussion surging across social media. The hospital room, already cold and sterile, now felt disturbed by secrets yet to be revealed. The man remained still, unaware that every glance, every shutter click from the hallway had turned his presence into a new focal point. Under the stark, white light streaming from the ceiling, his silhouette stood out like a giant question mark, pushing the whispers beyond the hospital corridors and into the murmurs of a society waiting for a truth to come to light. The prosecutor's office stayed lit through the night. These days, the air thick like a silent battlefield. On long tables, files were stacked high, each folder stamped urgent, every computer screen looping the viral videos circulating online. No one could maintain composure anymore, from seasoned prosecutors to young assistants, all were under unprecedented pressure. The incident was no longer a single misstep. It had become a national flashpoint, and without immediate action, public outrage could spiral into a full-blown crisis of trust. That's why, on the very morning after Rosa was hospitalized, a special investigative unit was formed. It wasn't a temporary task force, but a coalition of elite prosecutors, veteran detectives, and forensic experts, all urgently summoned from different regions. The chief prosecutor, in an emergency meeting held in the large conference room on the third floor, delivered a firm declaration: justice cannot be delayed. This investigative team will handle the case from beginning to end, leaving out no detail. His words fell like a command, silence in the room before the sound of flipping papers and furious typing filled the air. Stern faces lit up with determination. Everyone understood this wasn't just a professional assignment, but a test of integrity for the entire system. The team immediately divided responsibilities, some tasked with collecting every video, others verifying witness identities, some analyzing image and audio frames, reviewing every second, every scene of the now infamous clip. Outside, social media continued to boil, and that pressure accelerated the work inside the prosecutor's office at an unprecedented pace. Videos from multiple angles poured in, some shaky, filmed by students, others crisp from nearby security cameras. All were downloaded, lined up side by side, played and replayed to ensure the truth remained intact. Every word, every motion from Kane's punch to Rosa's expression as she fell was paused and annotated. Even minor details like the moment her earring hit the pavement were flagged because each was a vital puzzle piece in reconstructing the full picture. Alongside the videos, witness statements were collected urgently. Every bystander present was contacted, either brought in or connected remotely to recount exactly what they saw. In a small room off the hallway, a student's hand still trembled. As he recalled, "I was filming on my phone, my hands were shaking, but I clearly saw him punch her in the face without a single warning." His statement was recorded and matched with the footage, becoming undeniable evidence. A middle-aged woman, her voice catching, said, "I rushed to help her, but he shoved me down, screamed at me like I was the criminal." Each testimony etched deeper into the big picture, making Kane's actions all the more vivid and indisputable. Within the tall stacks of files on the desks, each witness statement and video clip was neatly organized, marked with red and blue tags for classification. The scene resembled a massive puzzle, slowly coming together, every piece carrying the community's outrage and grief. Prosecutors sat for hours in front of screens, eyes bloodshot, but locked on every frame, knowing that the truth had to be uncovered with absolute precision. Tension filled the hallways, but with it came an unfamiliar yet powerful sense, the feeling that this time justice could not be overlooked and that they were holding in their hands the chance to restore a shaken public trust. The prosecutor's office had never buzzed with this kind of urgency, and within that atmosphere, the arrival of the special investigative team felt like a flame sustaining hope. Those gathered in that room understood they weren't simply investigating a case of violence, they were bearing the weighty responsibility of holding an abuser of power accountable and delivering a real answer for Rosa and millions of others. The folders kept piling higher, but this time they were no longer just stacks of paper. They had become weapons, bearing witness to the truth society was demanding. On the third morning after the video went viral, an emergency meeting took place at the city police headquarters. Outside, hundreds of reporters stood by, cameras aimed at the large entrance, while inside the atmosphere was thick with tension and scrutinizing stares. Police officials, long accustomed to dodging tough questions, now faced pressure with no escape. Every piece of evidence had been compiled by the special team. Every witness statement documented clearly, all pointing toward a single undeniable truth. Officer Kane's actions had crossed the line from maintaining public order into blatant violence. When the lead prosecutor stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent, every gaze locked in. With one clear sentence, "Kane is suspended from duty." His career collapsed instantly, and those watching knew they had just witnessed a fracture within law enforcement itself. Kane received the news in a small office, his face paling, the usual forced smirk fading away. The badge he once flaunted was now retrieved, placed in a thick envelope, his hand trembling as he signed the suspension order. In that moment, the arrogance that had shielded him for years seemed to dissolve, replaced by a stunned, bitter disbelief. Even if his teeth clenched and his eyes still flashed with defiance, the decision had been made. There was no way back. Outside, the news spread immediately. Reporters rushed to break the story, and news tickers across TV channels confirmed it. Officer Kane officially suspended from duty. Immediately following the announcement, the prosecutor continued, speaking his tone firm and unflinchingly angry. "This is not an accident. This is intentional assault." That statement landed like an early verdict on Kane, stripping away any room for justification. Those who had tried to defend him, who once dismissed it as a professional mishap, were now forced into silence. The public heard those words through a live broadcast, and applause broke out in many places, not inside the hall but from apartments, coffee shops, and among the protesters in the streets. They knew that at least this time justice had been called by its true name, and Kane's actions were no longer protected by any layer of excuse. In the prosecutor's office, young staff who had worked through the night exhaled with relief as their leader finally said what they had seen in the evidence from day one. A young assistant took off her glasses, eyes red, and whispered, "It's finally been said." Trust in justice, once shaken by repeated disappointment, now flickered back to life, and the stacks of case files on the desks no longer felt like a burden but proof that their work had not been in vain. Out there in the hospital room, where Rosa still lay unconscious, these words could not yet reach her ears, but they had surely ignited a new flame in the hearts of those awaiting justice on her behalf. Kane had lost his badge, lost his position, and the prosecutor's words had shut the final door to his defense opening, instead a legal road he could no longer escape. That morning, the city courthouse became the focal point of the entire nation. From the front gate, long lines of citizens waited to get into the courtroom while the rest crowded outside to watch through large temporary screens. The air was thick with anticipation, with tension that felt ready to explode. When the courtroom doors opened, each footstep echoed against the cold wooden floor, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Inside, every seat was filled. Reporters sat shoulder to shoulder, cameras lined the aisles, lights flashing without pause. From the elevated bench, the judge tapped the gavel, lightly, eyes stern, as they scanned the room before speaking in a deep voice. "The hearing begins." That voice rang out, marking the start of a morning where all eyes turned to one man, Officer Kane. The attorney for the plaintiff stood up, remote in hand, gaze sharp. He didn't need a long opening statement. He only said one line: "The truth will speak for itself." On the large screen behind him, the fateful clip began to play, and this time not at normal speed. The footage was slowed down to each frame. Every movement, every gesture was crystal clear from the moment Kane shouted, raised his fist, to the instant it crashed directly into Rosa's face. The original audio returned the screams of the crowd, the sickening thud of her body hitting concrete. That slow-motion replay made spectators grip their seats tightly. Some gasped in outrage, and a few bowed their heads, unable to watch the brutal moment. The lawyer paused the video on the frame, showing Rosa motionless, blood pooling on the pavement, her earring thrown off, spinning until the glare of light hit it. His voice rang out steady, unwavering. "This is deliberate violence, not an accident. What you're seeing is the unfiltered truth." Those words, combined with the magnified image, struck like a hammer to the minds of everyone present. The courtroom murmur breath grew short, and from the back rows angry shouts broke loose. The judge had to pound the gavel several times to restore order, but couldn't calm the rising intensity in the room. Facing all of this, Kane sat in the defendant's seat, face tense, eyes bloodshot. When it was his turn to speak, he stood, adjusted his tie, and tried to steady his voice. "I was maintaining public order," he said, each word slow and controlled, trying to sound composed, but it came across as an empty excuse. The moment the sentence ended, outrage erupted from the courtroom. Someone shouted, "That's maintaining order. That's a crime." Another stood up, hand trembling as they pointed at Kane. "He hit an old woman who still believes him." The angry cries grew louder. The atmosphere spun out of control. Reporters scrambled to capture it all, and cameras panned across the defendant's blank, cold face. The judge struck the gavel harder, voice firm, order in the courtroom. But order was now only surface deep. Beneath it, every gaze still burned with fire. Kane lowered his head, sweat beading on his forehead, his hand gripping the edge of the chair. That brief defense did nothing to erase the truth exposed in every frame of the footage, and everyone in the room understood that no matter what he said, the darkness of violence had been brought into the light of justice, and the excuse of maintaining order only made his image more contemptible. The hearing continued, but the anger in the hearts of the people had already burst past the courtroom walls, spreading like a fire, ready to consume every lie. The sound of fists hitting tables thundered across the courtroom, pounding like war drums, stoking fury to its peak. Wooden chairs creaked as many rose at once, eyes ablaze, mouths shouting words of protest. Unacceptable. That's a crime. Prosecute him fully. The screams collided, echoing beneath the high ceiling, making the entire room sway. Reporters at the back pushed forward to capture the chaos lenses, sweeping over tense faces, hands slamming down so hard the skin turned red. The courtroom no longer resembled the solemn, orderly space it once was, but a storm of rage where public outrage drowned out any defense. Amid the noise, Kane sat frozen, blinking repeatedly, his face strained in a show of composure while his hands trembled visibly. He could hear every unofficial accusation shouted from behind, feel every stare like a blade pressing into his neck. People weren't just banging on tables, they were pounding on the wooden railing, the booming noise pushing him into a corner. The arrogance that had followed him for so long vanished, replaced by visible confusion. Each glance from the plaintiff's attorney further emphasized that this courtroom was no longer a place where hollow justifications could keep him standing. The judge, who had tried to maintain order from the start, finally slammed the gavel down hard, the sharp crack snapping the room into momentary silence. He stood tall, his voice deep and resolute through the microphone. This courtroom must uphold its dignity. However, I hereby declare this case requires further investigation. That statement froze the room before erupting into a wave of agreement. Everyone understood this was no longer an internal review, not a report to appease public opinion, but a commitment from the court that the truth would be pursued to its very root. That statement was quickly broadcast by reporters, cameras zooming in on the judge's face, capturing every movement, every tone in his voice. Further investigation is required became the quote instantly flashing across digital news headlines, social media timelines shared alongside images of the courtroom erupting in outrage. To the public, it was a glimmer of hope that justice would not be stopped by cold walls, that the cruel fist would be forced to face the truth all the way. Inside the courtroom, some were misty-eyed, some held hands and nodded, feeling that their efforts, their voices had compelled the system to listen. The hearing ended with the scraping of chairs and hurried footsteps, but its echo lingered. Kane was led away with his head down, while outside the crowd of thousands awaiting news erupted into chants. The judge's ruling wasn't the final verdict, but it opened the door for the full truth to come to light. In the late afternoon sunlight, pouring through the tall windows, floating dust particles seemed to reflect the shifting tide of justice, and everyone understood this was only the beginning of a larger, fiercer investigation that could no longer be ignored or hidden. The police department's records room sat at the end of a hallway, rarely visited, with old wooden shelves stacked high with files, the smell of decaying paper mixing with mold to create a suffocating atmosphere. A dim yellow light hung loosely from the ceiling, casting a weak glow that threw a flickering shadow on the peeling wall. In that quiet space, the sound of pages turning and cautious footsteps echoed softly as a young journalist followed leads he believed could shift the entire case. Before him, thick folders lay open line after line, revealing a shocking truth, a long list of complaints against Officer Kane spanning many years. Not one or two, but a string of incidents involving violence, abuse of power, and derogatory language. He paused, frowning, as he found citizen complaints detailing arbitrary stops by Kane, reports from colleagues describing aggression beyond protocol, even audio recordings of witnesses claiming they were threatened for speaking out. Each page turned like a knife, tearing through the false image Kane had crafted, exposing a man who had repeatedly crossed into the shadows of brutality. What shocked the journalist most was that at the end of nearly every file, the same cold phrase appeared: handled internally insufficient evidence for prosecution. Those few words acted like a net, erasing all traces, allowing Kane to keep his position and authority. He laid the files on an old wooden desk, hands trembling with anger. The accusations weren't new. they had gone on for years. Yet, somehow, everyone had Hadeen wiped clean under the label of internal resolution. Scribbled notes, familiar signatures from higher-ups in the department stared back at him as undeniable proof of systemic protection. He imagined citizens turned away from the complaints office, their voices swallowed by silence, while Kane walked on proudly, convinced no one could touch him. It was that very shielding that led to the punch that struck Rosa a chain of unchecked wrongs no one dared to stop. In that dim room, the truth felt too raw to believe. Letters buried at the bottom of drawers, blurry photos showing bruises on victims' bodies, all seemed to scream for visibility. The journalist sat still for a moment, then turned on his camera and began photographing every page. The shutter clicked steadily, like the beat of justice returning after years buried. He knew once these images were released, the public would lose patience with hollow promises, and the system that had protected Kane would finally be forced to answer. The dim yellow light seemed brighter for a moment, reflecting off the tense face of the journalist. He knew he had just touched the core of the case, the part many had tried to hide. These decaying files did more than expose a single office. They revealed an entire network of protection that had lasted for years. And when the creaky door of the old room closed behind him, he carried with him photographs, undeniable evidence ready to feed the blaze of justice already raging outside. Immediately after the files were exposed, the already tense public atmosphere erupted. Victims who had stayed silent for years began stepping into the light, appearing on television and press conferences and across social media platforms to tell their story. A middle-aged man, hand trembling as he raised an arm still bearing a faint scar, choked out how Kane had knocked him down just for asking why he was pulled over. A young woman sitting in an interview room, eyes red, recounted the trauma of being searched with her husband in front of their small child. Kane's insults still chilling her to this day. Then, a young man, only 16 at the time, admitted he was once yelled at and forced to kneel on the street for wearing baggy clothes. Each story wove into the next, every testimony, another hammer blow against an already fractured police force. Live television broadcasts streamed these interviews non-stop, forming a public archive of pain. Viewers recoiled at how often it had happened, how one officer could abuse power for so long. The victims who once stayed silent out of fear or lack of faith in justice now drew strength from society's collective outrage. Their presence was no longer isolated. It became a march of voices pointing together at the same perpetrator. Kane, once a smug officer, now stood fully exposed under the light of justice, not just for the punch that struck Rosa, but for a long-stained history. Meanwhile, national media outlets ran headlines without restraint naming Kane in terms never before used. Print papers ran bold, front-page titles, "Savage Cop." News stations broadcast his face in close-up, spliced with victim accounts, making clearer than ever the brutality that had been hidden for so long. On social media, the phrase spread like wildfire, appearing in millions of posts, turning Kane into a symbol of corruption, a man loathed by an entire society. Memes emerged pairing his face with blazing red captions, turning every last trace of arrogance into a public mockery. The weight of public opinion was no longer a scattered wave, but a storm sweeping away every attempt at justification. Each time a new witness came forward, the media added another layer of evidence to Kane's dark portrait. Each time an article labeled him a savage cop, belief in the possibility of change grew stronger. Society began to see clearly that the truth could not stay buried forever, that justice, even if delayed, could return more powerful than ever. Kane was no longer just a single wrongdoer. He had become a warning sign for a system that had allowed brutality to run unchecked for far too long. And from that moment on, the people understood that this fight was no longer just for justice for Rosa, but to force the entire system to change to ensure that savage cops like him would never have a place to exist again. In the days that followed, the incident was no longer confined to the United States. Images of Rosa unconscious on a stretcher, the brutal punch from Kane, and testimonies from past victims were broadcast repeatedly on international news. On the screen of a major news channel, the headline scrolled, "Elderly woman beaten by U.S. cop." The phrase was short but shocking, drawing viewers from around the world, not because it was sensational, but because it exposed a disturbing truth in a society that claimed to be democratic and civilized. Photos of Rosa lying comatose, her pale face in the Stark hospital room, alongside of footage of crowds protesting in front of the police station, were shown again and again as visual evidence. Immediately, international human rights organizations spoke out. In a live press conference from Geneva, a spokesperson for a prominent group declared, "We call for full transparency in the investigation and urge the United States government to ensure justice for the victim." The call, echoed, translated into multiple languages, and broadcast across evening news programs. They emphasized that the incident was not simply the act of one rogue officer, but a reflection of systemic inequality that had persisted for years. Global pressure mounted, aimed not only at Kane, but at the entire mechanism that had enabled his abuse for so long. European and Asian media did not stay silent. Major newspapers in the UK, France, and Germany published stories featuring Rosa and the slogan, "Justice for Rosa," in bold on their front pages. TV channels in Japan and South Korea replayed the punch, with tense narration stressing that their audiences could hardly believe this could happen in a country that preached human rights. In India and the Philippines, many online outlets ran analytical pieces comparing the case to abuses in their own nations, treating it as proof that injustice knows no borders and that Rosa's suffering had touched the heart of humanity. On global social media, English-language hashtags spread rapidly. Justice for Rosa, police brutality, Kane, the abuser. Users from different countries shared the clip, added subtitles in their languages, and turned the story into a shared headline anyone could understand. One person in Berlin wrote, "When I saw that old woman fall, I thought of my grandmother. This is a global pain." A user in Seoul commented, "If justice isn't served in America, what hope do we have anywhere else?" These voices from across the world didn't just express outrage, they created pressure that demanded a response from the American government. In political meeting rooms, the Rosa case was cited as a prime example of a human rights crisis. Diplomats were directly questioned by international media, asked to explain the investigation process and commit to reform. This forced U.S. leadership out of silence, as once the nation's image became tied to police brutality, its credibility on the global stage began to waver. The darkness in the hospital room where Rosa remained in a coma had extended beyond its walls, becoming a spotlight in a global debate. International attention acted like a spotlight on a wound, allowing no concealment or avoidance. Kane was now not only facing judgment from his own people, but scrutiny from the entire world. Every comment, every article, every statement from a human rights organization added to the mounting pressure. And from that moment forward, the Rosa case was no longer a local story. It had become a symbol of the fight against abuse of power, crossing borders, crossing cultures, reaching everywhere. People longed for justice. The international pressure came like an unstoppable wave. Each human rights statement, each expose, each image of Rosa in a coma flooding foreign broadcasts, the U.S. government under intense scrutiny. Routine press briefings, once focused on economics and foreign policy, were now constantly interrupted by one question: how will the government respond to this shocking case of police violence? The White House spokesperson initially maintained a calm tone, but their tense expression and uneasy eyes revealed the truth. There was no turning back. The domestic outrage combined with global pressure had forced the administration out of its silence. In a statement broadcast live, a government representative declared that the investigation would be closely monitored, emphasizing that no one is above the law, not even the police. The words echoed in a room packed with journalists, but outside millions watching on their screens remained unconvinced. They knew the statement was not only meant to reassure, but was also a sign that the administration had been compelled to respond as the nation's image was now under worldwide scrutiny. At the same time, Congress received hundreds of thousands of signatures demanding a public hearing, while other states began to voice that they did not want to see a similar tragedy repeated. The Rosa incident was no longer a local event, it had become an international flashpoint. Global news outlets provided continuous updates linking scenes of protests in the U.S. with smaller marches across Europe and Asia where people held banners in various languages. On the streets of London, hundreds gathered with signs reading "Justice for Rosa." In Paris, students chanted "Pas de silence," affirming that one person's pain could become a shared voice for humanity. Even in Seoul and Tokyo, small candlelight vigils were held, their flickering flames dancing in the night breeze, carrying a message of cross-border solidarity. In this context, the United States suddenly became the focal point of a global debate on human rights and accountability. Every statement from American leaders was analyzed, scrutinized, and weighed. International commentators wrote that this event would be remembered as one of the moments when public pressure forced a government to shift its stance. From a hastily recorded video on a sidewalk, Rosa had become a symbol that challenged an entire power structure, while Kane's name had turned into a stain repeated across headlines everywhere. The world was no longer just watching the fate of one woman, it was waiting to see how a nation would prove that justice truly existed. The courtroom that day was packed, not a single seat left, the air thick with anticipation waiting for the decisive moment. The spectators sat shoulder to shoulder, many gripping their hands until their knuckles turned white, eyes fixed on the judge's bench. Outside the courthouse, hundreds gathered, eyes locked on a large temporary screen broadcasting the entire trial live. Silence blanketed everything, broken only by the soft rustle of paper and the steady clicks of camera shutters. No one dared breathe too loudly, no one dared move unnecessarily, all waiting for one declaration. The judge entered with a solemn face, his eyes reflecting the weight of the moment, as if he too felt the pressure of history. After a few brief formalities, he paused, and in a deep but clear voice that echoed through the room declared, "Officer Kane is officially indicted." Those 4 words, short and firm, shattered weeks of suffocating tension. The crowd inside erupted, cheers rang out, many clapped uncontrollably, and tears flowed in overwhelming emotion. Strangers embraced tightly, tears fell, not just from joy, but from the release of a long-suppressed pain. Outside the courthouse, the crowd also erupted like a wave breaking free. Chants of justice for Rosa echoed across the plaza, flags and signs waved under the sunlight. People hugged and cried, elderly spectators who had followed the case from the beginning sat down on the curb, their faces glowing with relief at finally witnessing a moment of justice. News outlets immediately broke the story, and digital billboards in major streets displayed the headline, "Kane officially indicted." The event spread instantly. Across social media, drawing millions of shares within minutes, each comment filled with a mix of relief and determination to keep watching. Inside the courtroom, Kane sat frozen, his face, pale hands trembling as they gripped the edge of the table. He had believed in protection, had counted on loopholes to escape, but now everything collapsed in a single instant. Camera lenses zoomed in on his face, capturing every flicker of confusion, the arrogance he once carried gone, replaced by panic and fear. Across from him, Rosa's family sat in silence, tears streaming down their cheeks. They didn't cheer like the crowd, but their eyes glowed with the belief belief that the first step toward justice had finally arrived. The moment the initial verdict was announced, it felt like the whole nation shook. It wasn't the end, but it was a declaration that the crime could no longer be hidden, that the system could no longer turn its back on the people. The cheers, the tears, and the tightly held hands turned that moment into a milestone, opening a new path where justice was no longer an empty promise, but had begun to take shape through concrete action. Cain had officially been brought before the law, and society understood that from here the road to truth might still be long, but there was no turning back. While cheers and applause still echoed through the courtroom in one corner of the gallery, Rosa's family quietly held each other. No words were needed. Their tight embraces and trembling shoulders were enough to convey the relief after days buried in fear and anger. Rosa's daughter's eyes were red, the faces of relatives streaked with tears, and all bowed their heads, allowing that sacred moment to soothe the pain still raw. They knew the initial ruling wasn't the end, but they also understood it was the first step to ensure Rosa, lying cold and unconscious in the hospital, would not become a meaningless victim in a society yearning for justice. That embrace, simple yet profound, was both an act of comfort and a vow to stay strong until justice is fully served. Amid the murmur of the media and the flashing lights of cameras, a tall figure slowly stood from the front row. Marcus Hill, Rosa's son, stepped into the aisle, his steady strides casting an unexpected silence across the room. No one said a word, but every gaze immediately turned to him. Marcus didn't need grand gestures or a prepared speech. His eyes alone quieted the space. In them was the quiet pain of a son, the restrained fury of a witness, but above all, the commanding presence of someone whose strength alone could hush a crowd. Reporters swiftly turned their lenses toward him, capturing every step, every movement. Some in the courtroom held their breath, no one daring to make a sound because even a glance from Marcus felt like a warning. He stopped at the center of the courtroom, stood tall, eyes fixed first on the judge's bench, then turned toward the defendant. Cain kept his head bowed, hands clenched tight, but his shoulders trembled as if Marcus's presence alone pressed down on him. No words were spoken, but the charged silence said everything, a silent verdict, resolute and undeniable. The crowd watching the live broadcast outside the courthouse also fell silent when the image appeared on the giant screen. The cheers paused, replaced by solemn stillness, as if everyone sensed the arrival of someone significant. Marcus Hill did not stand there merely as a son. He represented a power not yet revealed, a hidden force waiting to speak. That commanding gaze instilled in the people a renewed belief that the road to justice would not be abandoned, that behind Rosa stood a pillar strong enough to confront the entire system. In that moment, the entire courtroom, the square outside, and everyone watching through screens understood that a turning point had just begun. Rosa was still in the hospital, but her family had found strength in Marcus, and society had found a new symbol of resolve. He had yet to speak, but that silence was louder than 1,000 promises, a quiet affirmation that this fight was far from over, and that justice would not be left unfinished. In the cold, white hospital room, the ceiling light cast down onto Rosa's pale face, etching every wrinkle deeper into her skin. The steady beeping of the heart monitor echoed through the room, each sound a reminder of the fragile line between life and death. Marcus stood silently by the bed, his eyes fixed on each faint breath. His mother took his hand, gripping her thin, cold hand, feeling the chill seep into his skin. He leaned down, his voice low but firm, and whispered into her ear, "I will make justice come to light." That promise wasn't just for his mother. It echoed within his own mind like a command he could not retreat from. Marcus's gaze softened as he recalled a childhood filled with hardship. He saw again the image of their old leaky house during rainstorms, where a small woman bore the weight of everything just to raise her son right. Rosa had taken on dozens of odd jobs, from house cleaning to doing laundry for others, just to to afford school supplies and a hot meal for her only child. Many nights she came home drenched in sweat, her shoulders trembling from exhaustion, yet she always managed to cook a warm dinner and smile at her son as if none of the struggle existed. That memory made Marcus squeeze her hand tighter as a deep ache and boundless gratitude surged within him. He remembered cold winter mornings when other children were driven to school and Rosa walked with him through the fog, encouraging him with the words that knowledge was the strongest weapon to change a life. She never allowed him to miss a day of school even when tuition was a burden. She always found a way to cover it. Marcus knew that it was her unwavering determination that shaped him, made him strong, and brought him to this point. Standing by her bedside, he felt he now carried the spiritual legacy of his mother, and that his vow to protect the truth, to protect justice, was not only a duty, but a way to repay the years she had sacrificed. The white light above cast a soft glow around Rosa's face, making her appear surrounded by a sacred stillness. Marcus looked at his mother longer, realizing she was still fighting even in her motionless body and closed eyes. He believed she could hear him, that his promise would reach her, would hold her here just a little longer. Inside Marcus, a fire of resolve blazed stronger than ever, no longer just fueled by rage over a punch, but by the responsibility of a son to the mother who raised him, to the community waiting for justice, and to his own conscience. At that moment, the small hospital room seemed to become a place where past and present met. Rosa lay still, her body exhausted, but the memory of her resilience remained vivid in Marcus's mind, urging him forward. The whispered promise at her bedside wasn't just a private vow, it was a banner that would lead him through the days ahead where greater trials awaited. And when he lifted his head, the white light reflecting in his determined eyes, anyone who saw could sense that a new chapter had begun, one in which justice would have to be present with no other option. The white light from the ceiling reflected across Marcus's face, his eyes burning with a determination like a flame that couldn't be extinguished. He leaned in closer, his large hand gripping his mother's frail one, feeling every faint but steady pulse. In that moment, Marcus seemed to pour all his strength into that trembling hand, his eyes lingering on Rosa's face, memorizing every line, every mark of time, like a vow that no matter what he would not let her fall in silence. That resolve didn't just mirror the pain of a son. It carried the presence of someone ready to stand against an entire system to reclaim justice. The air in the hospital room seemed to settle. The steady beeping of the heart monitor became a backdrop to the heavy silence. A few nurses stood at the far end of the room watching quietly, their eyes fixed on the scene before them, as if drawn in by an invisible force radiating from that grip. A young nurse leaned down, her voice trembling slightly but filled with admiration. Her will to live is unbelievably strong. That gentle remark seemed to brighten the whole room because it wasn't just a medical observation, it was a recognition of endurance that surpassed the limits of the body. They saw clearly, even as Rosa lay motionless, her spirit was still fighting a quiet force holding on to life. Marcus gave a slight nod, his eyes never leaving his mother, as if agreeing with those words. He knew that strength wasn't new. Rosa had always been that way. She had survived hunger, poverty, had raised a child alone through relentless hardship, and now even with her body broken, her will remained firm enough to astonish anyone. That only made Marcus squeeze her hand tighter, as if to affirm that he would carry that resilience forward, turning his promise into a shared strength for everyone. The white light shone down on the clasped hands, casting a contrast on one side, wrinkles and age spots on the other, unwavering strength and determination. That contrast formed a vivid image of maternal love and the pursuit of justice. In that moment, the hospital room was no longer just a place of treatment, but the starting point of a powerful resolve where love and will merged into one opening hope for the days ahead. Marcus tightened his grip on his mother's hand once more, and the silence of the room was replaced by a quiet belief that from this trembling hand a new journey was beginning. The National Press Conference Hall blazed with flashing lights, hundreds of reporters crammed together with cameras, video equipment, and microphones raised high, all waiting for the moment the announcement would be made. The air was thick with tension, every breath caught in chests, as everyone knew this event would mark a turning point in a case shaking the world. The spokesperson stepped up to the podium, carefully adjusted the microphone, and spoke clearly across the room. "We hereby confirm Marcus Hill, the son of the victim, Rosa, is a general in the military." That sentence hit like a bolt of lightning, slicing through the silence, shattering all previous speculation. Immediately, the crowd erupted. Gasps filled the air chairs, scraped, and camera shutters fired off in a chaotic storm. Reporters from all directions raised their hands with urgent, stunned voices. "Are you certain this information is accurate? What operations has General Marcus Hill led? Will this affect the investigation?" The room trembled with noise, and outside on the live broadcast, millions of viewers fell silent for a moment before diving into a flood of reactions. On social media, the name Marcus Hill exploded in mentions accompanied by shock, as no one had imagined the quiet man holding his mother's hand in the hospital would wield such authority. Toward the back rows, several international journalists exchanged glances and quickly took notes, knowing this was no longer a private family matter, but a political bombshell. A military general's mother was beaten into a coma on the street by an ordinary police officer. This was no longer a simple criminal case, but a severe blow to national credibility. Every word from the press briefing was documented instantly, circulated by major news outlets, followed by headline after headline. Shocking twist. Victim Rosa, his mother of General Marcus Hill. Police misstep turns into political crisis. The shock didn't end inside the hall. Outside the building, thousands of citizens watching on giant screens erupted in cries. Some clutched their heads in disbelief, others cheered, and many stood silent, eyes glowing with renewed hope. They understood that when justice is tied to someone of such high military standing, the path to truth would only gain strength, and few would dare stand in its way. Kane, once smug after throwing the punch, now had to face not only public outrage, but the weight of military authority bearing down on him. In the moment when camera flashes still blazed across the room, an image of Marcus Hill appeared large on the central screen, a steadfast man, eyes resolute, silent, yet full of authority. He didn't need to speak. Truth had just spoken for him, a stunning plot twist in itself. The room remained filled with restless noise, but somewhere in the crowd, whispers had already begun. This battle had entered an entirely new phase, and this time, justice would carry an undeniable force behind it. In the days following the explosive press conference, images of Kane in custody emerged, captured by a reporter's lens through the steel bars. No longer wearing the police uniform that once gave him swagger, nor the smug, crooked smile he used to wear, the man now showed only a pale, sunken face that had lost all sense of control. In the cramped cell, a dim yellow light cast shadows over his tense features, clenched jaw, and vacant, evasive gaze. Several journalists described him as sitting in a daze for hours, his hands trembling, a man seemingly devoured by his own fear. The same man who once shouted into an elderly woman's face, now sat surrounded by four cold walls, forced to confront the deadly consequences of his own violence. Out there, as news spread that Marcus Hill was not only Rosa's son, but also a military general, public reaction ignited like fire meeting dry grass. On sidewalks and coffee shops, even in online forums, a phrase repeated over and over. He punched the mother of a general, short-cutting and heavy with implication, not only exposing Kane's stupidity, but symbolizing a complete reversal of power. Some people laughed dryly when recalling it, not out of joy, but from bitter irony, knowing the man who once stood above the law had turned himself into a national joke. In markets, housewives repeated the phrase like a warning to their children about the price of arrogance. In classrooms, students discussed it as living proof that justice sometimes returns turns through the most unexpected turns. The media wasted no time seizing on the detail. Major newspapers blasted headlines, political commentary shows ran analysis after analysis, repeating the now iconic phrase like a bitter summary of the entire tragedy. Images of Kane, sitting slumped in jail, were placed side by side with portraits of Marcus Hill in uniform. The general's piercing gaze starkly contrasting the broken demeanor of the man who once swung his fist with impunity. That contrast only fueled public outrage, but also brought a deep sense of satisfaction knowing justice now stood on firmer ground than ever before. In evening gatherings, people discussed the story as if it were a modern legend, where one brutal act led to an irreversible downfall. "He punched the mother of a general" was no longer just a whisper. It had become a catchphrase, a biting remark repeated everywhere, reflecting the belief truth had finally begun to prevail. As for Kane, curled up in his jail cell, he surely heard echoes of that sentence reaching all the way to where he was locked up, each repetition like a blade, cutting deeper into the shame he would never be able to erase. The Capitol building was packed that day, its hallways crowded with reporters, cameras pointed directly at the main chamber, where lawmakers were preparing for one of the most anticipated debates. After a series of scandals and mounting public pressure, the police oversight bill was officially brought before the full Congress. The draft, hundreds of pages long, outlined detailed provisions to strengthen accountability, requiring every action by law enforcement to be monitored through an independent system. As the presiding officer read the opening lines, the already tense atmosphere thickened, each lawmaker sitting upright, eyes fixed, awaiting what could become a historic political turning point. Sharp rebuttals broke out. Some conservative lawmakers argued that tight oversight might weaken police response in emergencies, but immediate pushback followed, stressing that security could no longer be used as a shield for abuse of power. A young congresswoman stood up, her voice firm. "No one should hold absolute power without being held accountable. We've seen a woman fall into a coma because of an officer's arrogance. If this Congress hesitates any longer, we lose the right to represent the people." Applause erupted from the rows behind her, a clear affirmation that change was the only way forward. As the debate reached its peak, key leaders stepped up to speak, pledging that police reform would no longer be a slogan, but a concrete legislative mandate. They emphasized mandatory body cameras on uniforms, the creation of independent boards to handle civilian complaints, and strict penalties for officers who abuse their authority. A senior congressman spoke slowly but with weight. "We are not writing laws to patch cracks. We're rebuilding the foundation. If we don't act today, there will be more Rosas tomorrow." His words brought the room to a hush, followed by renewed, prolonged applause. Outside, citizens gathered in front of a massive screen set up in the square, following every word of the debate. They listened, discussed, and many nodded as leaders promised reform. Images of young people holding up signs reading "Justice for Rosa" appeared on television broadcasts, a reminder that this bill was not just a legal document, but the result of a sweeping social movement. Inside and outside the Capitol, tension mingled with hope, creating an atmosphere of unprecedented urgency. And in the moment the bill was officially added to the agenda, everyone understood the system had been forced to change, and the promise of reform could no longer be undone. As the police oversight bill was brought to debate, the special session of Congress grew even more intense when past victims of Kane and others who had suffered abuse of power were invited to speak. They did not appear as statistics in a report, but stood at the podium with the real stories of their lives. An older man with graying hair spoke with a trembling voice, recalling how years ago he was pulled over by Kane for no reason, searched on the street simply because of his skin color, and how that memory still leaves a scar inside him. After him, a young woman in tears shared how her family lived in fear after her husband was assaulted by Kane in front of their child. Each testimony was a cut through the false narrative of protect, and serve, forcing those seated in the chamber to confront the long-ignored consequences of systemic cover-ups. The room fell silent as a young man stood up and recounted how as a teenager he was dragged out of a car, yelled at, and forced to kneel in the street just for wearing a baggy shirt and walking through his own neighborhood. His voice faltered, but his eyes shone with intensity as if to say the pain was not his alone, but shared by an entire community mistreated and unheard. One story followed another, needing no fancy words, just the raw truth enough to make many lawmakers lower their heads and viewers across the nation watching the broadcast wipe tears from their eyes. They realized Rosa was not the first, but the breaking point in a long chain of injustice that had gone unacknowledged. National media aired the session live, and audiences everywhere witnessed each testimony. On social media, clips of the victims were shared alongside captions like, "This is why reform matters." The public no longer accepted empty promises. They saw clearly that without real change, those wounds would reopen again and again. The power of honest voices from those who had been hurt sparked a renewed belief that society was entering a new chapter and where justice could no longer be a slogan but had to be made visible through real action. From these stories, a culture of accountability began to take shape. Lawmakers discussed not just laws, but real oversight mechanisms where every officer would be held accountable to the community they serve. Senior officials announced that anyone in the force who violated rules, no matter how small, would face legal consequences. In police academies, new lesson plans were drafted stressing that a badge was not a shield to hide behind, but a promise tied to discipline and integrity. In society, people began to believe their voices mattered, that if they stood united and persistent, they could compel the system to change. And in that moment, the seed of a new justice was planted, sowing in each person the belief that the shadow of cover-ups must finally give way to the light of responsibility. Night fell, and the once busy square turned into a sea of glowing lights as thousands of candles were lit. People from all walks of life, young and old, rich and poor, gathered in solemn silence, each holding a small candle, the faint lights blending into an endless stream of brightness. At the center of the square, a large photo of Rosa was respectfully displayed, her face gentle yet full of pain, with a magnified image of her golden earrings beside it, a reminder of the fateful moment etched into the memory of the community. No orders were given, no slogans shouted, but every gaze, every tear formed a shared rhythm, as if the whole city beat with one heart. The flames flickered in the night wind, but none went out, because whenever one dimmed, another hand would reach down to relight it, spreading a new spark. That unity was not limited to this square. It was broadcast live, allowing millions in other countries to join the moment. On social media, images of the illuminated square flooded in, accompanied by captions in many languages from English, French, and Spanish to Japanese and Arabic, all directed toward Rosa as a symbol. People in Berlin, Paris, Seoul, and Mexico City also lit candles in the streets, their images transmitted across borders, connecting small points of light into a global map of justice. Amid the silence and glow, a speaker stepped onto the platform, his voice echoing through a speaker not loud but clear and firm. "This is not just a case, it is a warning to humanity." His words quieted the crowd, thousands of eyes lifted, breathing in unison. He continued, "If an elderly woman can be struck down just because of her skin color, then any one of us could be next. Rosa's case is not the story of one country. It is a reminder that justice must be protected everywhere." These were not rallying cries, but sobering truths, moving many in the crowd to tears, while those watching from afar could not contain their emotions either. Applause rose like a wave, spreading from the front rows to the edges of the square. There were chants in response, but most remained silent, letting the lights and unity speak instead. The event was not just a memorial. It became a festival of light, of belief and resilience. In every candle, people sent a promise to keep fighting, and in every eye a determination that the darkness of injustice could not forever prevail. From Rosa, a wave had spread beyond borders, becoming a global echo, engraving the message that justice has no nationality, only the basic right of all people everywhere. The image of the candlelit square didn't stay confined to one city. It spread across international news channels and appeared simultaneously on major newspaper front pages. Within days, the story of Rosa and the fight for justice exploded into a global topic. From New York to London, from Tokyo to Cape Town, people shared the video clip, and long-form editorials appeared in international media analyzing every detail of the case. In South America, marches broke out with banners written in local languages but still bearing the English phrase, "Justice for Rosa." In Europe, students and scholars organized emergency forums using this case as a clear example of the need to monitor law enforcement. In Africa, communities that had long endured inequality spoke out, seeing Rosa as a voice for their own struggles. This global spread didn't stop at emotional solidarity. It actively influenced ongoing social movements. International human rights organizations attached Rosa's name to new campaigns using her image as a symbol, calling for transparency in policing across countries. Foreign politicians referenced the incident in speeches, calling it a wake-up call, not just for the United States, but for every government. Rosa's story appeared in university lecture halls, featured in lessons on law and public ethics, becoming material for younger generations to reflect on the duty to uphold justice. On social media, hashtags related to Rosa crossed linguistic borders, appearing in dozens of languages from German, Korean, and Spanish to Arabic. People around the world posted photos of themselves holding candles or signs, writing that they felt Rosa's pain as if it belonged to their own communities. Street art depicting her image appeared on walls in Paris, Berlin, and Buenos Aires, transforming Rosa into a powerful visual icon accompanied by slogans demanding justice. In evening broadcasts, news anchors called the movement an unprecedented wave, where a local incident erupted into a global message. From small protests and simple messages, the story broke beyond the confines of a criminal case, becoming a symbol against abuse of power worldwide. Rosa was no longer just a victim. Her image came to embody resistance to all forms of violence carried out by those in authority. International journalists wrote that Rosa had become a torchbearer for the movement toward transparency, helping people everywhere recognize that when one person is trampled, all of humanity must speak out. Her name was mentioned alongside figures who had sparked historical change, now placed within a broader context where justice and human dignity transcend borders. And so Rosa's story didn't end in America. It continued to live in the hearts of millions as a reminder that power only exists when held accountable, and justice endures only when it is protected by all. The clear blue sky stretched over the square where the solemn ceremony was held, a light breeze catching the national flag and sending it rippling high above each red, white, and blue fold, reflecting sunlight like a reminder of the values everyone had gathered to protect. On the podium, Marcus Hill stood tall, uniform, crisp eyes blazing with determination. He held the microphone, his voice carried through the speakers, firm and resolute like a vow addressed to the entire nation. Justice is not a badge, it's truth and courage. Each word landed with weight echoing across the space, causing the vast crowd to fall silent for a few seconds, as if to etch every word into their hearts. Moments later, the square erupted. Applause thundered from every direction, rolling from the front rows all the way to the farthest edges. Many couldn't hold back their emotions. Tears flowed freely, faces turned up toward Marcus as if finally grasping a tangible hope. In the crowd, elders clutched the hands of their grandchildren. Young people raised banners high, all united in the belief that this day was not just a tribute to one person, but a declaration of a new path for justice. The chant, "Justice for Rosa," rose again, mingled with applause, but this time it rang out not in anger, but in pride and unshakable belief. Behind the stage, Rosa's image appeared on the giant screen, her gentle smile from old photographs lit up as if standing beside her son in this defining moment. People bowed their heads in remembrance, feeling that her pain and sacrifice were not in vain, but had become the force that moved a society to change. The wind passed through, sending thousands of small flags in the crowd fluttering like a sea of signals, echoing the promise to carry forward the values Rosa had paid for with her life. In that solemn atmosphere, national leaders and international organizations stood among the crowd, clapping, nodding, and prepared to carry the message back to their own countries to spread the spirit of accountability and courage. The ceremony was not only a memorial, it was the establishment of a legacy. That legacy didn't exist on paper, nor was it confined to the sentence given to Cain, but lived on in the hearts of the people in the reforms already taking shape and in the collective resolve to ensure no one else falls victim to unchecked power. As the ceremony came to a close, the evening sun spilled over the steps leading down to the square, but people remained, many quietly lighting candles and placing them beneath Rosa's photo as if to extend the flame of justice. Marcus's words echoed on, "Justice is not a badge, it's truth and courage." That is the ultimate legacy, one that will not fade with time, but will be passed down through generations, reminding them that justice lives only when people are brave enough to defend the truth, and that truth once spoken will never be extinguished. As the ceremony came to a close, the sunset stretched across the square, the rows of seats gradually emptied, but the echoes of that moment still resonated in everyone's heart. The story of Rosa ended like a book whose final page had been written, but its impact did not stop there. It became a collective memory passed on in family conversations and classrooms and the recollections of those who once held candles in the brightly lit square. Each person who left carried a part of the story with them, and in that way Rosa remained alive in the conscience of society as an unerasable symbol. News broadcasts gradually shifted to other topics, but Rosa's name continued to surface in discussions on reform and lectures on human rights and justice. Many young people revisited the event as a historical lesson, clearly seeing that the strength of a community and the courage of individuals could change an entire system. Rosa's image was no longer confined to that of a victim, but became proof of a people's resolve of the power to turn pain into action, loss into strength. The story concluded, but the awakening it inspired kept spreading, opening new paths for justice. The greatest legacy Rosa left behind was not only the reforms that had begun, but the belief that justice can never be distorted if the community rises together. A single officer's punch had once shaken the entire city, but the truth ultimately prevailed, and it won through the power of ordinary people who dared to speak up. Marcus vowed that justice is not a badge, it's truth and courage, and that statement became a guiding light for millions, quoted in international forums and conversations about social reform. It was a spiritual legacy, a torch that lit the way for anyone to believe that truth, even when buried, will always find a way back. And so, from a small street from an unjust blow, Rosa's story crossed the boundaries of time, becoming a message to future generations that justice is the right of all people. Truth always wins because it carries human belief, because it is protected by courage and unity. The story may have ended, but that legacy lives on like a shared heartbeat of society, like a light that never goes out, reminding us that justice cannot be buried, and the truth, one way or another, will always be heard. The story of Rosa ended in the light of justice, but its echoes still resonate in the minds of millions. From a sweltering afternoon on a crowded street where a frail, elderly woman was knocked down by a brutal punch to a grand square glowing with candlelight, the entire journey told not only of pain but also of the power of truth and resilience. Rosa could not speak for herself in that fateful moment, but her still image became the beginning of a movement that crossed bar borders, a movement where the most ordinary people rose to defend dignity and honor. Marcus Hill, the son who quietly stepped out of the hospital room with resolute eyes, carried that spirit forward with a promise that could not be withdrawn. He did not choose the path of revenge, but turned his family's pain into the strength to drive change. When his true identity was revealed, the world was stunned, for behind calm demeanor stood a military general, a man with the power and authority to turn outrage into action. But above all, Marcus was still a son, standing by his mother's bedside, holding her hand, whispering a vow that justice must be brought to light. That image was a reminder that the greatest strength does not come from rank, but from love and unwavering resolve. Rosa's story sparked a profound lesson about the responsibility of every individual in society. A passerby who stopped to record a group of students who turned anger into a collective statement, a journalist digging through archives to uncover buried truths, all showed that justice cannot be built without small, quiet acts. It was the persistence of those seemingly anonymous people that laid the solid foundation to force an entire system to bow to the truth. Each action, no matter how simple, lighting a candle, sharing a video, became part of a larger force that turned Rosa from a victim into a symbol. More importantly, the story proved that justice does not stop at national borders. As Rosa's image spread across the world, it became a global echo, urging communities everywhere to reflect on their own realities. From the streets of Europe and Asia to the squares of South America and Africa, candles were lit, voices were raised, all reminding us that wherever there is abuse of power, there must be voices to resist it. Rosa, through her silence, sparked a cross-border wave that connected people through a shared longing for justice and human dignity. The greater lesson lies in the belief that truth, no matter how deeply buried beneath layers of cover-ups and power, will always find a way to rise. Cain once believed the badge would protect him, that the system would continue to shield him, but everything collapsed the moment the truth came to light. The very punch he thought was an act of power became the sentence that would haunt him forever. From that moment, Rosa's story affirmed that the force of violence exists only in an instant, while the power of truth and courage endures. When Marcus Hill stood before the crowd and declared, "Justice is not a badge, it is truth and courage," it was no longer just a personal statement, but a message etched into the memory of a generation. The ceremony ended, but the legacy of justice Rosa left behind continues to be passed on. People will tell her story to their children and grandchildren, not as a tragedy, but as proof that unity and bravery can transform a society. And each time the story is retold, that message becomes even clearer: justice can never be distorted, and truth will always prevail.